Hi, this is Greg Kesich at the Portland Press Herald, and I'm here with Cynthia Dill and Molly Adams from marketing. And we are going to have a conversation about some issues around Maine politics and an elephant in a room. And also, I would like to talk about the social media phenomena around the Harvey Weinstein allegations and the way that it's getting people to talk about sexual harassment, sexual assault. And then later, we have a segment with Megan Doyle, a reporter who will talk about the From Away series and give us some insight into how that series came together. A really impressive piece of work. But first, let's go to the elephant in the room, Cynthia. This was the announcement, the announcement last Friday by Suzanne Collins that she wasn't going to do the thing that we didn't really think she was going to do anyway. But were you surprised? Were you impressed?
I was impressed with the rollout of the announcement. As I wrote in my column, I thought that she did an admirable job just keeping people in suspense. Of course, there were obviously predictions, and some people were right and some people were wrong. And I was somewhat surprised. I had thought all along that she should stay in the Senate, and I, for many weeks, predicted that she would. But then in the final days, I pivoted to believing she might run because she was making the announcement in Maine. But obviously I was wrong. I was glad I was wrong. And I already see her flexing the muscle that she has as, one of 52 Republicans, one of only 2 or 3 moderates, in her recent comments about Trump's action on Obamacare. I mean, she's got her sleeves rolled up and she's doing stuff, which is exciting.
Yeah, I was watching that speech and thinking there's not that many people, even people in the Senate, who could make a kind of speech like that about health care in such detail, speak so clearly with such a command of all the different intricacies of all these complicated interlocking programs. And that's taken a long time to develop that expertise, and it would have been a shame to lose that, to have her come start a new job, learn a new, I'm sure she would have been a fine governor, I'm sure she would have been a step up, I think almost anybody would be a step up from the governor we've got. But I just felt like, this was like watching, Michael Jordan try to play baseball. Like, she really has earned her place in the Senate, and it's one of the most consequential people up there.
Oh, absolutely. And what's so interesting is the tables have turned so quickly. I mean, for a while, she was in the wilderness as a moderate, and people thought she might, be phased out, and we would see only extremists. And what the irony is that Donald Trump actually has leveraged her power more probably than anyone could have predicted. I mean, the fact that she didn't endorse Trump, and then Trump was elected to everyone's surprise, and now, because of the numbers in the Senate, she wields incredible power. And so all of a sudden, a moderate is back on stage where people are really thirsty for these kinds of policy details. At least some people are. And especially amid all the cacophony with, the back and forth catcalling and tweeting and personal name-calling by the president and some other senators, to have Maine senators speak, as you said, with expertise, is, I think, a real boon for Maine. And she is now one of the most powerful people in the world.
Wow. So, Molly, you were a Maine native, but you've been away for quite a while. You've been back for about a year. What's your perspective on Suzanne Collins? I mean, you grew up here. She's kind of been in the background your whole life, right?
Yeah, I think particularly Suzanne Collins and Olympia Snowe as these 2 moderate female senators was a part of the Maine brand. That was something people would comment to me if we were talking politics, like, well, you have 2 really great people from Maine, like the clear heads in the Senate through the Bush years. I feel like there was always a lot of respect for Snowe and Collins. I will say, as a loyal listener to the podcast, I now know that you guys are not full of it. You know what you're talking about, correct predictions from everybody around Suzanne Collins. And I think what you just said now, Cynthia, about her clout and her influence in the Senate, being a moderate and being a centrist is actually like kind of a trendy position right now. I see so many people on social media. It's almost like this badge of honor, like that the progressive, from the far left to the far right, people see them as extremes, and they're both so reactionary, and I'm the cooler head in the middle that can actually make sense of it, whether that's a correct position to have. But that's something that I think in these really divisive times, more people want to identify as a moderate or coalesce around a moderate. So
I agree. The challenge for Democrats is that for the longest time, and I would say even including now, the adjective, if that's right, moderate, was only applied to Republicans. You would never hear about moderate Democrats. And so there is, I think, a real void or opportunity for not only moderate Republicans like Susan Collins, but moderate Democrats to speak up, because Susan Collins, I think, did Democrats a service by pointing out that, yes, you can still belong to a political party and be independent, which is something that I have been probably beating a dead horse with. But I really challenge all of the so-called independents, unenrolled people to listen up and listen and see what she has done with her independence. She's part of a party, so she can actually do things and has influence, but at the same time is independent.
That's interesting. Like the centrist Democrats, the adjective we always give them is conservative.
Yeah.
Like Democrats are conservative,
right,
and centrist Republicans are moderate.
And moderate's a better word. The Republicans always get the better words, They do.
Is that an accident? Do they make us do that? Do they?
I was really intrigued by Roy's points last week. If people want to go back and listen to last week's show with Roy Leonardson, the Republican strategist, about how often I thought it was such a good critique of Democrats, and I say this as somebody who is an unenrolled voter. I don't vote with any party, that they lose control of the narrative, that the party is so easily put on the defense instead of playing offense. And he was saying in particular welfare reform, that Republicans start saying there's welfare fraud, and I know the president was talking about it again today, welfare reform. There's welfare fraud, it's rampant, millions of people are misusing the program. And the Democrats' strategy has been to be like, it's so small, it's not an issue, it's mean-spirited, that tactic, instead of saying, no, this program's great, and we care about this program, and if there is fraud, we're going to track it down. That instead they play defense instead of flipping it and playing offense all the time. And I think that's not true in every case, but very often how I see the Democratic Party reacting to these big stories.
That's interesting. I mean, certainly this whole Susan Collins speculation has occupied a lot of attention that's not going to Democrats who want to, present an alternative to 8 years of Republican rule. And we have 10 candidates, I think, at this point in the Democratic primary alone. It's going to be hard for somebody to kind of break out from that pack without some kind of really identifiable vision and an ability to tell a story.
But I think Collins makes some really good points on some fixes that could maybe shore up Obamacare to the satisfaction of a good section of Republicans.
Yeah, in the Senate, when you're talking about the health care.
Or even in general in the business community. So I think some Democrats could say, you know what, I support the Affordable Care Act and I don't want it to be repealed. However, I can get on board with some of these fixes that other people are talking about, like moving the work week from 30 hours to 40 hours, or, there are places that Democrats can advocate for moderate positions. And I think, again, just take up the space that has been created by the new popularity, or like everything comes around full circle in fashion, and now maybe being independent is fashionable because people want to separate themselves from Donald Trump. And so to the extent that the Democrats are putting forth really good candidates, which I think they are, I think there's some safe space for the Democrats running to take some centrist views and not totally have to kowtow to the extreme left.
Mm-hmm. What about the way the primaries work? Doesn't that make it difficult when you look at the very low turnout June primary?
Well, that's the interesting question, though, when it comes to these.
The one person in the room who's actually won one of these.
Yeah, right. And I consider myself a moderate, a PS, but what would be interesting, I think, now is for the congressional seats anyways, if the ranked choice voting is going to apply to the seats in Congress, because apparently the law court ruling on ranked choice voting doesn't apply to the federal elections, then I would think certainly moderates have a higher chance of succeeding with ranked choice voting. But even in a regular primary, I think that the state is small enough. You can go out and meet people face to face and do retail politicking, and it's not really so much about the positions people take on issues. It's really about trust and, do you think the person is going to work for my interests, and is the person honest? So I think that Democrats can occupy that moderate space.
Should we move to the next topic? I think we're good. Okay.
Because I had a thought that moved us directly to the next topic, which was the Democratic establishment's response to one of their major donors being a serial sexual assaulter. Okay. So we're talking alleged.
Alleged.
He's admitted. Oh, no, he says it's all consensual, everything he admits to. So Harvey Weinstein, if someone has totally not been in the news, that's what I'm talking about. And I found it pretty horrific that the story in conservative media was somehow able to turn Harvey Weinstein into the equivalent of a publicly elected official in his capacity as a large Democratic donor. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Sort of.
That's the way I heard the story first. I heard the first thing I heard was this guy whose name I vaguely remembered hearing before was somehow proof of bias in the media because we didn't cover it the way we covered the sexual assault allegations against President Trump.
Yes.
And then I started thinking, like,
I see what you're saying.
Who is this guy? And then I started, he's famous. He's a producer. And then I started hearing more and more of the story. And the New Yorker piece came out, and it was, oh my, this guy is a really horrible person, And there are lots of these stories, and these are just the people who were willing to come forward and put their name on it. And then more and more people came forward against him, and then the next iteration of the story was this is a Hollywood problem. This is the casting couch, and that there's these guys who are very, we're all talking about guys, very exploitative and using their power in Hollywood. And I think we're in like a third wave of it now where people are saying it's not just Hollywood, it's where I work too.
Yeah, and that's been a message, for a very long time, but for me as a young person since 1992, am I getting my early 90s year mixed up? When Anita Hill testified. I believe it was
91.
I was a child.
90 or 91, yeah.
And that's such a formative thing to me, like that somebody would be so high profile and so professional and be treated so disrespectfully in their office. Imagine having to explain that to a 5 and 6 year old who's watching TV, because the news was always a big part of my house. But I found it, not that I think it's fine if the DNC wants to return the money that Harvey Weinstein donated to them, but that there was no pushback from official people, not that people haven't been pushing back on this as commentators, that Harvey Weinstein is not the same person as Donald Trump. He's not a person who is running for public office. That somehow he's been politicized as representative of the left, and the left is now somehow hypocritical for not, just really infuriates me, because, and maybe that's because we're in this politically divided time where everything is getting infused with politics. But it was so upsetting to me to see this issue, which clearly has no partisan, for me, has no partisan meaning attached to it. It happens to everybody. It is done by everybody. To see it politicized is such a bummer to me, because you can't have an honest conversation about it. It has to be about politics when it is sure it's about power, but it's about interpersonal relationships.
Well, I think though that the Republicans are looking for any distraction from the sexual assault allegations connected with the president
in Puerto Rico.
And I think the reality is that the people, because money in politics now plays such an influential role, that I would, I guess, push back a little bit and say that he is almost like, people who are in the positions to donate millions of dollars and exert that kind of influence on the political process, on somebody's career, they are almost equivalent to an elected official, because they basically control elected officials with their money. I mean, we live in a society that is ruled by donors. The donor class. I mean, they are the ones who are picking the candidates. They're the ones funding the campaigns. And so I don't blame Republicans to try to link Harvey Weinstein with the Democrats, especially when one of the pictures is actually, it was a great picture of Hillary Clinton sort of like has her hands on his chest in one of the Washington Post articles, where I was thinking he probably said something rude and she was like punching him in the chest, which, you know.
Was that at Trump's wedding?
Yeah, I don't know.
I guess there is a Republican or conservative line of attack that liberals are hypocrites, and they say that they care about good things, but they really also do really bad things. And I don't know where to go with that. Yeah, yes, it's true. Everybody's a hypocrite. People do bad things. People are complicated. But I have trouble also defending the media on this, because the more I read about it, the way Harvey Weinstein used the media was sort of the tool he used to silence his critics and punish people who didn't play ball with him through these gossip sites. Mm-hmm. And you know, maybe it's ironic, but the gossip sites are what brought him down. It was the reporters could see all these stories piling up and knew there was something there.
What's going to be interesting to me is to see what comes of this Ronan Farrow piece in the New Yorker, because Ronan Farrow is he's connected to a certain extent because he's the son of Woody Allen.
Did you find that there was no full disclosure in the New Yorker article?
I know. I thought that was odd. And it's coming on the heels of the reported rape case from the Rolling Stone, which blew up. I'm not saying that it's not a true story. I kind of think we haven't heard the end of the story.
Wait, which story?
Well, the story of whether or not some of the reporting you said is the media was being manipulated by Harvey Weinstein to influence the outcome. And what I'm saying now is I think a lot of people are manipulating the media. If for instance, people who have an interest in the outcome or have a personal connection to the issue or the person are, reporting on these stories. So it's going to be interesting. And I also think that if there are criminal charges and legal proceedings, we could be in for a long, long, long story.
I think this is maybe a question, or maybe it'll end up being a scenario posed to you, Cynthia, because I think nothing kind of illustrates the difference between the court of law and the court of public opinion than a rape or sexual assault case. I think what a lot of men are learning about these past couple weeks are things like whisper networks, how women do not always press charges. We do not always go to the police when there's an incident because we don't know if it's going to be believed or investigated properly. And instead, it becomes a personal justice that we mete out on people by letting everybody know that this is a bad person, by now that women are a little further into areas of power, maybe blacklisting somebody from an event, by posting their image on the internet with the word rapist on it anonymously, that we see Harvey Weinstein, and I think this is what a lot of men really fear, that you aren't going to see any legal repercussion for what happened to you, but you're going to see a deep public shaming. And
I would love to think that the Old Girl Network is onto that. I mean, that's clearly what has to happen, because I think the justice system, as much as I'd like to think is the answer, it's not. And the media does not have the resources or the inclination to follow these stories forever because of the cycle of the news. So, I mean, to the extent that women are wielding more power and do have these networks and are, in a way, collaborating and behind the scenes, exerting influence on, scumbags, I think that's great.
And it's almost like what men fear more than the legal repercussion. When I see,
I don't know what men fear.
Yeah. I'm kind of afraid all the time of almost everything. But
speak for the men, Greg.
Yeah, no, I think.
While we're stereotyping.
I mean, when you describe this situation where there is a anonymous shaming done on the internet that can, destroy somebody's reputation, I'm a little.
You're not supportive of that?
I guess I would like to see. I wish the criminal justice system would be able to handle that. Where there was some kind of, evaluation of the evidence, and I know it's imperfect, but it's the best thing we've got. What I'm seeing is like, what I'm wondering about is it reminded me a lot of the Bill Cosby case, where the media, we didn't cover it. These allegations would come and they were all isolated. Until finally they started to pile up. And I'm wondering if, when Bill Cosby was a young man in Hollywood and hanging out at the Playboy Mansion, that his behavior was all that unusual. I suspect that a lot of people were doing what he's doing, maybe to a lesser degree, maybe not as consistently over the years, maybe involving less compelling victims. And Harvey Weinstein, is picking on famous movie stars who have some ability to speak out.
Yeah, I think it's a really important conversation for a lot of reasons, and one of them is that, like you pointed out, Molly, that there is a lot of people getting involved and talking about it, because there's a disconnect between a lot of men and a lot of women about what is consensual. Yeah. I mean, it's the oldest, dilemma, I think, in the book, is that men really think that some women like, sex all the time and related to everything, and a lot of women don't.
But I don't think any man thinks that women want you to just you can meet them in your bathrobe and chase them around an apartment.
Oh, you'd be surprised. Oh my God, I think you'd be surprised. A lot of women think that if they were in a bathrobe, that it would be. There's just this weird. I think there has to be. But what I'm saying is that what's important about this national conversation now is that women are speaking up and saying, you know what, we don't want you to be in your bathrobe when we're working. That's pretty clear, and I think people are getting it a little more, because Taylor Swift, I think, is actually a real role model in terms of using the legal justice system, right?
Yeah.
Some guy grabbed her and she brought a case,
But she was a bigger star than the guy.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
And so that's the part, that's the power dynamic, is a lot of times when somebody isn't a Taylor Swift.
Oh, right.
They don't have the same right to make that. Or they don't have the same ability to make that.
She also didn't go to court until he sued her.
Right, but what I'm saying is that her whole legal case, she didn't want any money, and she said over and over, "I just want people to feel comfortable about talking about this." Mm-hmm. And now, since then, we've had, we're going to continue to have them. It's just, I don't think this is ever going away, but hopefully, the more it's in the light, sunshine is the best disinfectant, apparently.
I think it is a shifting social norm. And I also think about, the way that we educate about sex still to children and teenagers is so poor to nothing. I've heard so many personal stories about where do you cross the line from being a creepy dog to an actual assaulter? When do you know that consent has been withdrawn if there had previously been consent? And these are, young adults asking these questions who have a lot of experience and yet still feel confused about it.
I wish it was about sex. I don't think the Harvey Weinstein thing is about sex at all.
Well,
it's
yes.
not. It's just about power.
And I also had to explain that to a man.
Yeah, and yes. I think women want power. That's what it's about, is women want power. And so they want to be aligned and associated with powerful people. They want to move up in their careers. They want to succeed. And unfortunately, in order to do so, you have to deal with powerful people in your industry. And if they're scumbags, you have to be equipped to deal with these things. And it's impossible if you're 21 years old and, you're confronting this 50-year-old guy in a bathrobe in a hotel room. It's just, I think it's impossible to be educated in any way to
deal with that.
To deal with that.
Yeah,
because you have to you're trying to get something from that. You know what I mean? You got to keep him off you at the same time. Try not to leave with your reputation in shatters.
Yeah, you're right. And it feels like this whole week there's been this burden on women to disclose what's happened to them and teach people. And but part of it though is I really think men need to understand what an everyday occurrence this is to women, to the point that you don't even notice or remember it
Yeah,
sometimes.
definitely.
Like, it's just if every day and every week, like, I would get hung up by somebody holding on to my hand too long, touching my shoulder, like, just all those little things, it would drive you nuts. You'd be unable to, like, move forward in your life. And that's one of the things that really struck me, how much people would say, I never saw anything. If I had seen anything, I would have intervened. And then the actress Léa Seydoux was like, he was doing this at parties.
Yeah.
He'd be cornering women at parties. So how can anybody say that they don't know? It's that they weren't seeing it.
Yeah, exactly.
They weren't looking for it.
Or they just didn't really care. They had their own career plans, and I'm not saying that that's right, but I do think in a lot of instances people turn a blind eye for their own self-interest.
And yes, and it was tolerated by a lot of people who should have known better.
Absolutely. The board of directors, I'm sorry, all of a sudden this oh my goodness, we're going to fire him in the Academy Awards. I guess I feel a little disgusted with the reaction by all the people who were silent and complicit and enabled him by just, exploiting, his success, his monetary success at the expense of all these people who were harassed or groped.
I feel like I've been through a few of these national conversations, like Molly, that, you talked about the Clarence Thomas hearings. I mean, those were riveting. And then there was the Bill Clinton impeachment, the kid, the anti-feminist kid, and I just call him a kid. He was like 20 years old in Southern California, who wrote all this terrible stuff about women. And yes, he was a mass murderer, but that also led to a whole Twitter.
Another hashtag.
Yeah, it was like a hashtag. I'm sorry, it was at the time it was new, and I thought like, oh wow, because I have daughters, college age daughters, and I thought like, oh wow, this is really interesting. People are really sort of broadening this story out and not just looking at this one incident, but showing how prevalent this kind of attitude about women's role and who has power and in that case it was somebody who felt like he should be Harvey Weinstein, but he didn't have the power, and he was so angry by the fact that he wasn't able to to demand that kind of treatment. So anyway, I guess I've been through a few of these, and I'm wondering if this one is going to be different, or if there's any kind of, if there's any progress we can track.
I do think that one thing that's different this time around is the political context in which these allegations are coming forth is Donald Trump. And I think so many people are trying to figure out what to do in response to what happened in the election, that maybe, the Weinstein conversation around, Me Too, along with Donald Trump getting elected, along with a lot of the other, Suzanne Collins, a moderate woman exerting so much influence, hopefully will generate some reaction that's not just a hashtag, that's not just a social meme, but actually like women getting elected to office, putting on the board, being more directors, actresses, et cetera, in Hollywood.
Yeah, I do feel like we've been in the last even 8 years, like this period of change, and there is some sort of power shift happening, which is why we definitely will always see one step back, because the establishment wants to reestablish and reclaim power. But it's still, I don't know what just made me think of it. It is still very frustrating to see, I feel her pain to see Rose McGowan, who got a $100,000 settlement, and the platform that she has to talk about her pain. And I'm like, I feel like I'll know things have changed when like ICE is no longer waiting at court to pick up women who are trying to like get an order of protection against their abuser. All the women who like cannot report what is happening. A woman who's working like the one minimum wage job she can in her change.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's really discouraging.
Right. It's a good thing we're living longer.
Exactly. There you go. That's a hopeful note. We're going to live for a long, long time. Well, thanks a lot. This is really interesting.
Thank you.
I'm here with Megan Doyle, who is a reporter who was part of the team that produced the From Away series about immigration in Maine. So thanks, Megan, for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
It's a really spectacular series. How big was the team that worked on this? It's a really impressive piece of work.
This team really involved a lot of people. John Richardson was the editor who came up with the idea and pushed for it to keep moving forward. We had a handful of reporters on the project, Randy Billings, Gillian Graham, Kelly Bouchard, myself, Noel Gallagher, Peter McGuire, and then we had a team of saintly online producers that put it all together. So there's a lot of kudos to be shared.
Wow, they don't usually get described that way, so I'm sure they'll appreciate it. One of the things that really struck me was the way it was organized around the different methods that people come here. You know, a lot of times we kind of do shorthand in journalism and talk about immigrant issues, but it really made clear that there isn't just one kind of immigrant. There's lots of different ways.
Well, I think we packaged it as a series in part because we wanted to show the diversity of this immigration system in the United States. We were motivated to put this project together because we wanted readers to learn a little more about the diversity and the complexity of this system that's in the midst of such turmoil and change. And you know, there's a lot of talk about different programs and different types of immigrants. And I think there's some real value to taking a step back and understanding different channels in which people come to the United States and come to Maine. So in part, it was a 12-day series to show that, to cover a lot of information and to really reflect the complexity of this issue.
Right, like what's the difference between an asylee and a refugee?
Right.
That was very helpful. And I think a lot of people maybe don't think of some of the other categories. Like, what were some of the ones that you were surprised by?
Well, I learned a lot about different types of visa programs and different types of immigrations through this project. I learned a lot in particular about special immigrant visas for translators who worked with the U.S. military in their home countries, and also about special immigrant juvenile status for unaccompanied minors who can't be reunited with their families or returned to their home countries for safety reasons. I had no idea really that those categories existed, but they really serve a very specific type of individual and are very focused.
In a lot of our work, we don't use anonymous sources or unnamed sources. It's been a pretty strict policy here for a long time. And in this series, there were a few cases, exceptions to that rule, where people were profiled who were not identified by name. And how did that come about?
Sure. Anonymity is something we take very seriously, and ultimately it's not my decision as a reporter. It's something that our editors, my editors, came up with or signed off on. In all of the cases in which we changed or omitted someone's name in this project, there was a privacy or safety concern. For example, Mahmood came here from Iraq as on a special immigrant visa. He was a translator, and his family back home could still be targeted for his work for the U.S. military. So we used his first name but not his last name in an attempt to shield them from any danger should this story reach them. And in other cases, for example, Cheke is a nickname for an undocumented man living in the greater Portland area. And we used an alternate name for a young woman who is protected by DACA or has been protected by DACA. Both of them could in the future or now be in danger of being deported, and chose to tell their stories on the condition of not using their name.
Why was it important to get their voices in, do you think?
Well, I think that they are people who don't always have a place to tell their story or the confidence to tell their story without being targeted. So it's important to share their experiences, especially as a program like DACA is under such review right now and is changing dramatically. We wanted to share facts about that program with our readers, but also share the personal story of someone who is a Mainer and has benefited from it. So as people make their own decisions about how they feel about a program like DACA, they are armed with both the story of someone they could consider a neighbor and with true information about what that program is.
As a reporter, how do you go about finding people? It's one thing to list out the categories, but how do you find the actual people and get them to talk to you?
Well, it took a really long time. We spent months looking for people who would be willing to be part of this project. And we were turned down by a lot of people who didn't feel comfortable sharing their story. But we had help from immigration attorneys at the Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project in Portland, from Catholic Charities of Maine, and other organizations that work on the ground with immigrants, providing services to them. Some of them were just kind of community connections. For example, Kelly Bouchard covers the city of South Portland and knew the man that she profiled as a naturalized citizen just from the community. He's a business owner, and she had written about his neighborhood before and learned a little bit about him and said, we have to tell his story.
Oh, yeah, it was a good one. I also liked the one, Mahmood. How did you find him?
He arrived here in May and has been receiving services from Catholic Charities of Maine. So we connected with him through there, but he also is sort of sponsored by retired Colonel Mark Leahy, a guy that he had met through the Army in Iraq. And
we should say he assisted American troops in Iraq.
Yeah. And Mark is a real advocate for Mahmood and has done everything he can to bring him here and make him comfortable here. And Mark pushed Catholic Charities to find a way to tell Mahmood's story because he really wanted to get it out there and have people learn about this young man. So they were very eager to connect us.
Yeah. I liked how he's anticipating seeing snow for the first time.
Yeah, he seemed a little nervous.
Yeah, right. Another interesting thing about this series was that there was no opportunity for people to make online reader comments the way there are at the bottom of most stories. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the decision making that went into that.
Sure. I didn't make the final decision on that. That was a decision made by the editors for the project. But it's very often that we publish stories about immigrants in Maine and see personal attacks develop on the comment section underneath that story. So we tried to prevent that in this case because often the stories comments will be disabled eventually, unfortunately. But there's still a lot of ways to engage with these stories and to share your opinions about them. Social media, for example, you can comment on Facebook or on Twitter. You could write a letter to the editor.
Yes, you could.
And on the website, there's contact information for all of the journalists that worked on this project. And we all have phone numbers and email addresses where we can be contacted directly to hear a little bit about what you thought of the project.
Yeah, I thought it was a good idea to do it in this case because there's something about the anonymous comments that bring out a particular strain of people out there in the community, and I've seen it with almost every time with any kind of immigration story or editorial or column. Things get personal very quickly, and it's as if nobody even reads the story, or that reader doesn't even respond to the story. It just sort of goes after the individuals. But it's I think gives you a little hint of why someone might be reluctant to talk to the paper and tell a very personal story. It really exposes them.
Mm-hmm. And we did have people that we approached to say, hey, would you be willing to tell your story? And some people said no, that they wanted to just keep their life quiet and protect their families from any negative feedback online, and we respect that.
Sure. So what kind of response have you gotten?
My response I've heard has been pretty positive. Actually, I've gotten a few emails and calls, not a whole lot, but I heard from Abdi Kadir, who was profiled as a refugee in the Lewiston area, and he said, he's had a lot of questions and positive feedback from members of his community and the organization where he works. So that was really great to hear. I had a caller today who was curious as to why we decided to call the project From Away, and said that, she is from away. She's from New York originally and has lived here for 5 or 6 years, and has struggled to find people locally that embrace her, that help her find a community here because they say she's from away. So she said, that's a really derogatory term. Why would you put that in the paper? And I thought that was pretty interesting. We had wanted to use that term in part because it's kind of thought-provoking and
it is. Well, it's an interesting concept, right? I mean, it's From Away is everything from the Merrimack River, to China. Is like it's all the same. It's outside Maine, and being from away myself, I'm a little sensitive to it, but it's an interesting way people have of looking at the world here, and you can see why people, if you're from New York and you feel a little like an outsider, imagine if you were coming from Burundi. So the last story in the series will be published this week, but people will still be able to find them online, right, Megan?
Absolutely. You can find all of the stories that have been in the paper, as well as interactive graphics, FAQs on these different immigration pathways, a quiz on the citizenship test to try your hand at it yourself, and video and other features online. The URL is pressherald.com/from-away.
Thanks for listening to the Portland Press Herald podcast. Make sure you never miss a podcast episode by subscribing on iTunes or your favorite podcast aggregator. For more of our podcasts, visit pressherald.com/podcasts. Follow the link there to this episode to leave a comment. You can also leave a comment on our Facebook page. Once again, thank you for listening to the Portland Press Herald podcast.